Hi, everyone. This is episode 10.2 in our series of famous quotes on Paul. This is historian Edwin Johnson from 1887. He's the same person who was in part 1 of episode 10. And here he's quoting Tertullian's work against Marcion from 207 AD, one of the most famous works in history, although neglected, I would say, in the modern era. But he's a century or so back, 1887, and he wrote a work entitled Antiqua Mater, A Study of Christian Origins, 1887. And we're going to be covering this work beginning at page 236. So I hope you enjoy, and we'll start now. He says here in this first quote, "It is clear that Tertullian had no liking for Paul. He calls him the heretic's apostle." So again, some people like to be biased and not accept objective historians. This person is not a Christian, nor leaning in any which way. He's a literary critic. He uses literary standards, and this is how he's reading the text. So before we dig deeper into Johnson's review of Tertullian's work against Marcion, let's learn a little bit more about Edwin Johnson. So this is his biography, and he's an English historian. He was born in 1842, died in 1901. He's best known for his radical criticisms of Christian historiography, which means he uses a literary critical method, which is a very high standard. You have to know the author. You need to have basically originals. You have to have a date that you can fix to things. And so if you use a very narrow level or the highest level of standard of proof, you have basically put a lot of things in question. On the other hand, he does delve into understanding and reading ancient texts because he can read ancient Latin and ancient Greek. Anyway, his description is formerly professor of classical literature in New College, South Hampstead. He's the author of Antiqua Mater, A Study of Christian Origins, which is what we're going to be looking at, and The Rise of Christendom. And in fact, he's written a lot of books. So let's go on here next. All right, so here's a quote page from Johnson's work, and he's quoting Tertullian and or summarizing him. So we're going to jump to the first line there. "It is clear that Tertullian has no liking for Paul." We're going to skip the next two lines. They're not really impertinent. Then it says, "He, Tertullian, hints that Paul's censure of Peter and the other apostles for their Judaistic leanings was inconsistent with his," meaning Paul's, "own after practice." And then the quotation is, "all things to all men." He calls him the heretic's apostle. So right there, you see a lot of critical remarks made by Johnson here in reliance on what Tertullian is saying. So what is Tertullian saying? He's hinting that Paul's censure of Peter and the 12, all the 12, that's in Galatians. He's very anti the 12 apostles. And Luther says, in fact, when he's calling the people false apostles, he means the 12 in context. And this is because they're pro-law. And Johnson calls that Judaistic leanings. And of course, that's inconsistent with Paul's own after practice, to be all things to all men. So we don't have any rules that would make people feel uncomfortable. We don't follow any things from the law. And then then Johnson says Tertullian calls him, Paul, the heretic's apostle. Now, continuing on page 237, Johnson says this: "He, Tertullian, goes as far as he dares in suggesting doubts about Paul and his apostleship. To those who reject Acts, Tertullian says, 'Who is that Paul of yours, the supposed author of Galatians? What was he before he was an apostle, and how did he become one? Everything has a beginning except God. He desiderates the origin of the apostle from Marcion. In general, a believer for believing's sake, as Tertullian is, here he protests against rashness. He assumes the air of a bold skeptic. A man is affirmed to be an apostle who is not to be found in the album of the apostles in the gospel. And then now he's quoting Tertullian, and then I hear that he was chosen by the Lord," page 238, "already resting in the heavens. It seems to me a want of forethought, as it were, that Christ did not know beforehand that Paul, was necessary to him, but that when the office of the apostolate had been already up to ordained, and they had been dismissed to their labors, he thought Paul must be added. quote, as this by an inrush and not by foresight, by necessity, so to say, not by free will. He goes on in his witty way to challenge the Pontic shipmaster, Marcion. Marcion was from the city of Pontus on the Black Sea, whether he has never taken smuggled or illicit goods on board his small craft, whether he has never thrown overboard or tampered with a freight. If he is too cautious and faithful in God's affairs for that, will he inform us under what bill of lading he took up the Apostle Paul, who stamped him with his title, who forwarded him to Marcion, who handed him on board, so that he may be landed in confidence and not be proved the property of one who has brought forward all the instruments of his apostleship. The arrogant temper of Tertullian takes particular offense at the pretensions of the writer of Galatians to be an apostle, not from men nor by man, but by Jesus Christ. And then he says this, quote, he's quoting Tertullian, by the way, anybody may make a self-profession, but the authority of a second person is required to confirm it. One scribes, another subscribes. One seals, another enters the record. A man cannot both profess and be witness to himself. Besides, we read that many would come and say, I am Christ. And if a liar could say this, how much more might not a liar declare himself to be an apostle of Christ? These are all quotes, by the way, of Tertullian by Mr. Johnson. Excellent critical principles. That's Mr. Johnson observing now. Now, before I read you this next quote, so after Tertullian goes about deconstructing Paul's validity completely as an apostle, he will retain him slightly at the very end, pursuant to the translation of Genesis 49, verse 27, in the Septuagint Greek. So Tertullian is living in an era where there's a mistranslation of this very passage, which materially impacted history, because he's going to say, I have to hold on to Paul for something, because I read Genesis 49:27 saying something about Paul will give us food. What it actually says in Hebrews, we now know, it didn't say, you'll see the prophecy of a Benjamite wolf at the same time of Christ's coming is very obviously Paul. God prophesied to Paul specifically in Genesis, just so you know. And the way it read in the Greek said that this figure would kill in the morning and in the evening divide the food, is what it says in Greek Septuagint mistranslation. But what it actually says in Hebrew is he will plunder the spoil. And so, he would divide and plunder the spoil, which we can see in the book of Galatians in particular. Paul is ripping apart the Gentiles and saying he has a partition treaty with the 12 that he can take it exclusively. Yet we never see that at all in the book of Acts, and it would violate Jesus' own command to the 12 to go to all nations with the gospel and spread his commandments to the world. So anyway, let's read. So this is very important, because a lot of people never read right to the very end of Tertullian's against Marcion, so they don't know why is Tertullian not completely disavowing Paul, and this is the answer, because of that translation mistake in the Greek. Let's listen. Page 239. However, Tertullian is willing to accept Paul as approved. On what grounds of authentication? Where is his voucher? Will our readers believe it? The proofs of Paul as of Christ are from the instrument of the Creator, the Old Testament. Genesis is in the Old Testament. Paul was promised to Tertullian from of yore in the book of Genesis according to the 70. He means the Septuagint. So he's very much aware what I'm telling you, that it's a translation error in the Septuagint, which is what causes Tertullian's mistake here, to misunderstand what God was prophesying. It says, Jacob says, Benjamin, a ravening wolf in the morning shall devour the hitherto, and at evening shall give food. Genesis 49:27. And again, that's a mistranslation. It was divide the plunder. Here, Paul of the tribe of Benjamin in early life, the persecutor, in declining years, the pastor of Christ's sheep and teacher of nations, is foreseen. King Saul, in his relations to David, is another type of Paul, as David himself of Jesus. Such are the sacraments of figures combined with the acts, which Marcion must not deny, that convince Tertullian. So Tertullian is, by the way, this shows you how important it is to summarize what you see on the page and don't overinterpret it. Let the reader see what you can see as an expert. And he does exactly that, does a good job. And that's, by the way, in book 4, chapter 1. Continuing on page 239, Johnson says, he, Tertullian, denies Paul then? No, he defends him and expels Marcion from the defense of him. In other words, he fights with Marcion for the true portrait of Paul, who must in some way be found to belong to the Creator and his instrument, the Old Testament and the prophetic spirit, or to a Tertullianic Paul, in short, and not a Marcionite Paul, the apostle of the other Christ, the teacher of a strange and new God. So, yes, this is exactly right. He's going to hold on to Paul just because of that one little verse, the mistranslation of Genesis 49, verse 27, and say there's some value, there's some food I'm getting from him, but but what he has said very bluntly is he's not an apostle of Jesus Christ. So he does not have that level of authority. Interesting how he divided this up and therefore robbed Marcion being able to claim this person can be an apostle, that because Marcion's view was Paul is the only apostle to follow and none of the 12 matter. So now once you get rid of the alleged apostle, the 13th apostle, you Christians all have to come out of Marcionism and come back to Christianity, and where the only true apostles exist. If you pay attention to what he's saying. And before I read this next page here on 240 is all the other scholars, they never tell you any of this stuff because they don't want to admit that he's denied to be an apostle. And then if you deny he's apostle, then you have to research and find out what's left. And all that is left is that passage in Genesis 49:27. And even you can see, Mr. Johnson knows that's a fraudulent Septuagint Greek text. And so Paul is hanging completely by the thread of a Greek Septuagint mistranslation by a pagan ruler named Ptolemy. And I think Johnson knows if you look at the Hebrew, this won't work. Paul should, but still a condemnatory statement by God in the prophecy that in the evening the ravening wolf, after having killed in the morning, will divide the spoil, divide up the Gentiles from the Jews, and be destructive and a killer. Excuse me, and a devourer of this what he's stealing from the original church. Okay, let's read what he says on page 240. Tertullian himself, while expressing the most audacious doubts as to Paul, turns the writings ascribed to him to the account of Catholicism and endeavors to force the Paul of the Acts of Apostles upon his contemporaries. In the absence of historical evidence that from the ideal world is strong, Paul is the ideal Benjamin, or the Saul of the latter times, the converted persecutor of the fold. Tertullian be our witness. So again, Tertullian saves Paul at the very end to at least have some value as this figure, what he calls the ideal Benjamin. And incidentally, in the early church, this Benjamin Wolf prophecy was routinely always spoken about Paul. I have about four different references. Jerome did it. All other people did it. It was only when the people started realizing the Greek Septuagint was false and the Hebrew was better known, it receded and people stopped saying Paul fulfilled this prophecy. See how easy it was to accept it when they thought there was half of it was good, but once it was all bad, they all gave it up and they never mentioned it again. And yet it was a very popular reference about Paul at that time. Okay, now that'll end this episode. I just wanted to make a comment of why Edwin Johnson is so important. Is all the Christian commentators that ever summarized against Marcion by Tertullian from 207 AD never ever mention clearly that Paul has been denied to be an apostle and destroyed as an apostle. They almost never mention that. And had they mentioned that, they would have then also had to look for, is there any recovery? And that's what Mr. Johnson also found. So Mr. Johnson is saying, hey, look over here. There is something left of him, and it's the way it's read in the Greek Septuagint. That's what is so subtle of him. He's saying in the 70, in the Septuagint. Septuagint is a word that comes from the Greek word for 70. So he's saying this is why Paul has any validity going forward for the Catholicism. And so all I have to say to other people who are being more aware now of what's really going on in the big picture is Johnson is opening us the door to say, hey, what did the Hebrews say? And that would have been the next obvious question to anybody reading him. And that shows us that Paul is negatively prophesied by God at the end of time, that when the Messiah comes, and I'll tell you why that's so in a second, is at the end of time, Paul will kill in the morning and he will divide the spoil in the evening. He will take the Gentiles away from the church. And how do we know this is the time of Christ? Well, just look at the prophecy as it begins. It's the prophecy of Jacob. He's about to die. He prophesies over each of the 12 tribes. He starts with Judah. Judah is in Genesis 49, verses 10 through 14. And when you look through there, you'll see it's talking about a figure who will rule the world. The scepter will not be removed from between his legs. He will then rule. And then it says, very interestingly, it says, and on his garments will be the blood of grapes. What do you think that sounds like? It sounds exactly like a crucifixion. And so we have a clear prophecy of Judah will have this Messiah who will rule the world. That's what a Messiah means, by the way, an anointed one. And kings were always anointed to rule. So that's why this figure in Genesis 49, verse 10, is clearly about a Messiah figure. And then you have later, 17 verses later, you have the prophecy of the Benjamite ravening wolf who kills in the morning and divides the spoil in the evening. And this was very well accepted to be about Paul when everybody thought it had the Septuagint Greek mistranslation of divide the food in the second half. But when they found out it said divide the spoils, oops, the attention to this passage that Paul was prophesied completely went away, because it would be a negative prophecy and no longer a positive one. So Johnson, this is what I love about Mr. Johnson. He's a literary critic, so he looks at things just for their literary content and their influence over history. And he detected exactly how come it was kept for all those couple of centuries until I think after Jerome, it dropped out by around 450. No one ever mentioned the Benjamin Ravening Wolf anymore. But before that time, there was at least 4 major writers in Christianity, who all thought this was a prophecy about Paul. All right. God bless everybody. Ciao. Bye.